pirating retro video games is illegal. This much is difficult to argue in most cases. Some companies' legal teams protect their older games more aggressively than others, but in most parts of the world, the law frowns upon digitally distributing copies of someone else's copyrighted material. The question is, though, is retro piracy actually morally wrong? According to the vast majority of you, retro piracy is hardly a tremendous sin. We ran a deliberately binary poll, with around 90% of respondents agreeing that yes, retro piracy is morally justified. It's clear that there's a strong sense among this community that downloading ROMs, emulating older hardware, and keeping aging games alive is perfectly acceptable, regardless of what the law might say. The truth is, though, as many have pointed out in the comments, this issue isn't completely black and white. There are grey areas within this debate. In some cases, piracy is the only way to play a retro title. In other cases, older games are perfectly preserved through legitimate means, making illegal downloads less widely accepted. Our intention in this video is not to give a hard, definitive answer to the question of retro piracy's moral standing. Rather, we aim to highlight other voices within this debate and present various viewpoints across several different scenarios. We hope to support you, the viewer, to make up your own mind about when piracy of retro games may or may not feel appropriate. To that end, let's first talk about art history. Chapter 1. Preservation or Death. The Reformation was a good era for religious and societal change, but a terrible era for art preservation. Protestants across Western Europe were eager to rid churches of Catholic idols, and that meant removing or destroying much of the region's historical religious artwork. This was perhaps most keenly felt in England, where Catholicism was not only suffering from a dip in popularity, but was actually made illegal. Priest hunters sought out and arrested anyone with a fondness for the country's former national faith. The destruction of historical art then continued following the English Civil War and the rule of Oliver Cromwell, a Puritan who eschewed fun in many forms. Cromwell banned the theatre and Christmas, and more of England's remaining historical artwork was destroyed. It's estimated that 97% of medieval religious art in England has not survived to the present day, and given that the Church was the primary patron of the arts before the Reformation, this means that much of England's cultural history is now lost forever. There are, though, a few remaining pieces of art which survived this purge, and which are now tremendously valuable. These have survived either because they were sealed away by accident and forgotten about, or because their owners defied Parliament and preserved them illegally. The Kiss of Judas, for example, survived because it was recycled. The Ten Commandments were written on its back and displayed instead. It's unclear whether this was a deliberate attempt to save a controversial piece, or whether it was just a good way to reuse an older decoration. Another piece, a statue depicting the body of Christ, survived because it was hidden underneath the floorboards in an old church. Again, it's unclear whether this was placed there deliberately to save it, or whether it was simply forgotten about, but it was only finally discovered in 1954. This is not too dissimilar to the way that copies of Action Comics #1, the original appearance of Superman, have survived to the present day. During World War II, the US government strongly encouraged the recycling of all paper, which is why the vast majority of comics from the era were destroyed. One pristine copy of Action Comics #1 was eventually discovered in 2013, hidden inside a wall. Video game preservation is a little different. For one thing, holding on to older games has never been explicitly illegal or socially discouraged by government. It's also different because, unlike these previous examples, it's possible to make a near-perfect copy of a digital file with ease, ensuring that even if physical copies don't last forever, and they won't, digital software degrades over a period of decades. These games can be archived and rescued from the destructive march of time. When we asked for your thoughts and opinions on retro game piracy, many of you mentioned the importance of game preservation. With examples from recent history of intangible media being lost forever, this kind of concern is completely understandable. There's a very real threat that many old games will be lost forever. Much of early cinema has been entirely erased. Many early film reels were melted down for use in manufacturing, leading to large gaps in archives of the birth of an entire art form that otherwise could have been preserved for future generations. At the same time, though, not everyone involved in retro games piracy is playing an active role in the preservation of older games. There's a big difference between the actions of those who archive older game ROMs and those who enjoy the fruits of this labour. Bear with us, we're going somewhere with this. Some archivists scour the globe, hunting for rare and obscure games that otherwise would be forgotten. Not just commercial releases, but early prototypes, beta builds, and bootlegs that don't get the attention of higher profile releases. These guerrilla preservationists often break the law in distributing these games online, but their work does indeed rescue many digital artifacts that would otherwise be lost. In contrast, those who simply download retro game ROMs to play on emulators aren't actively involved in the preservation of the art form. Yes, they've made additional copies of these titles, but their contribution to preservation ends there. In cases where increased attention to retro piracy draws the ire of litigious companies like Nintendo, it could be argued that a large number of would-be preservationists can actually harm the archiving and salvation of these titles. Some preservation efforts are more respectable than others. The Video Game History Foundation is a non-profit organisation which attempts to build a reference library of not just games, but source codes, media assets, and journalism surrounding games. While the games are preserved and even digitised, they're not distributed online. Thus, the preservation is achieved without breaking the law. That said, the Video Game History Foundation is not keen on some of the business decisions made by big game publishers that harm access to older titles. Publishers here specifically meaning Nintendo. As part of a statement regarding the closure of Nintendo Wii U and 3DS eShops, a Video Game History Foundation spokesperson said, "While it is unfortunate that people won't be able to purchase digital 3DS or Wii U games anymore, we understand the business reality that went into this decision. What we don't understand is what path Nintendo expects its fans to take, should they wish to play these games in the future. As a paying member of the Entertainment Software Association, Nintendo actively funds lobbying that prevents even libraries from being able to provide legal access to these games. Not providing commercial access is understandable, but preventing institutional work to preserve these titles on top of that is actively destructive to video game history. We encourage ESA members like Nintendo to rethink their position on this issue and work with existing institutions to find a solution." This statement raises a point connected to preservation, the question of public access to historical artifacts. Preservation does not necessarily mean distributing games for free to a wider audience, nor does it mean providing access to games in a way that contradicts the wishes of the game's copyright holders. That said, there's another element of preserving gaming culture that is gained from keeping older titles accessible. If a game cannot be played in any form, its cultural impact is diminished. Games live in the public consciousness only as long as they can be accessed. Part of video game preservation means preserving a game's cultural relevance and the memory of its existence. For a game to truly be preserved, it needs to actually be remembered from first-hand lived experiences. It needs to be accessible. Chapter 2. More Than a Memory. It's a Wonderful Life is a Christmas movie that was released in 1946, at a time when copyright law functioned very differently to today. The film, itself based on a short story entitled The Greatest Gift that was penned in 1939, is one of the most beloved Christmas films of all time. It was also, at the time of its release, a tremendous commercial failure. The film needed to generate around $6 million at the box office to break even. It made a little over $3 million, and failed to make any meaningful impact on the public consciousness. The simple version of what happened next is, copyright got weird. At the time, copyright in the United States initially lasted for just 28 years, at which point copyright holders could apply to have their right extended for an additional 28 years. Company mergers and acquisitions muddied the waters over who actually legally owned many films in this era. The copyright holder for It's a Wonderful Life in 1974, when the initial copyright term expired, was Republic Pictures. For whatever reason, perhaps negligence, perhaps lack of perceived interest, an application to renew the copyright was not filed, and the film passed into the public domain. This was no big loss to Republic Pictures, because who cared about a nearly 30-year-old black and white Jimmy Stewart film that nobody had heard of? Then, something magical happened. Now in the public domain, the film could be copied and distributed without concerns over licensing rights or royalties. It's a Wonderful Life became a staple for Christmas television viewing, and TV stations could air the film for free as often as they liked. Thus, an otherwise fairly obscure film suddenly gained a lot more public attention, and It's a Wonderful Life became the Christmas classic that it is today. Of course, as soon as Republic Pictures realised that their forgotten film was a hit, they found a different way to exert copyright over the film. But then, that's just how the media business works. The moral of the story is, sometimes wider, freer access to a piece of media can have a significant impact on its cultural legacy and place in the public consciousness. Just as an aside, if copyright law still lasted an initial 28 years, then everything up to the earliest PlayStation titles would currently be subject to an extension, and many 8 and 16-bit games that lack modern publishers would have fallen into the public domain by this point. There is a benefit to keeping public memory of older games alive. Just look at the way Nintendo continues to use sprites for the original Super Mario Bros. In original games like Super Mario Odyssey. These older titles are part of gaming's cultural heritage, and quite aside from the public good involved in preserving older games, there's a financial incentive for big companies to allow consumers to remember the past. What, though, of the games caught in an It's a Wonderful Life scenario? Abandoned by their original publishers, unavailable on modern platforms, legally unable to secure a commercial re-release due to licensing deals that have expired, unpaid royalty fees, or complicated rights-sharing agreements that were never intended to last this long. A popular example for this type of legal snafu is the operative No One Lives Forever, and its sequel, A Spy in Harm's Way. These games, originally developed by Monolith Productions and published by Fox Interactive, are trapped in legal limbo. Monolith was eventually purchased by Warner Bros. Games, while Fox Interactive was acquired by Vivendi, which in turn merged with Activision Blizzard. The result of this is that nobody knows who actually owns all of the rights to the game. Is it owned by Warner Bros., by Activision, or by 20th Century Fox? Or do the three companies all share some portion of the rights? Game developer and publisher Night Dive Studios has made a name for itself remastering older games that are otherwise unavailable, such as the original System Shock. The studio looked into similarly resurrecting No One Lives Forever, but found that the potential rights holders block the way at every turn. The deals relating to this intellectual property were done before the era of digital storage, so neither Warner Bros., Activision, nor 20th Century Fox had easy access to their records, and none of these companies were willing to put in the effort required to find out whether they legally owned any share of the game. The ultimate outcome is that No One Lives Forever and its sequel simply cannot be made commercially available in the modern era, because the companies that might own it refuse to find out whether or not it's theirs. In your comments on video game piracy, many of you noted that this kind of awkward legal barrier is one of the more justifiable reasons for retro games piracy. If a game can't be sold today, or if a developer or publisher refuses to do so, then many gamers feel that they're not depriving anyone of any money in pirating the games instead. In reporting on the No One Lives Forever debacle, Rock Paper Shotgun journalist John Walker said, "Rock Paper Shotgun ordinarily doesn't encourage downloading unofficial versions of games, but at the same time, we're strong advocates behind the concept of abandonware, where individuals and groups preserve and maintain the availability of games that are no longer available for legitimate purchase. No One Lives Forever and its sequel are certainly much younger games than would normally qualify for that, but my goodness, all the potential owners of the game sure have gone out of their way to ensure they can't profit from it." Kotaku's Zach Zviesen similarly said, "I find this situation frustrating and sad. It's unfortunate that the best way to play a huge swathe of old games in 2021 is by illegally downloading a ROM and playing it on an enthusiast-built emulation app. What's more frustrating to me is that there exists a legal option that would benefit publishers and players alike and could help old games retain their relevance, or sometimes even grow their fanbase. Were it not for the efforts of pirates, games like No One Lives Forever would fade from public memory, which, to a certain extent, seems to be exactly what the rights holders want in this case. What then of games that are available on modern platforms? In 2022, Sega removed Sonic 3 and Knuckles from the Steam store. This was one of the only places that the original version of the Mega Drive games, or an approximation thereof, could be legally purchased. The logic behind delisting this version of the game was obvious. Sonic 3 and Knuckles is part of the remastered collection Sonic Origins, and Sega wanted this to be seen as the definitive version of the game moving forward. What's more, Sega wanted to make more money from the sale of this new collection than from Steam users buying an older version of Sonic 3 and Knuckles on its own. This, though, meant that newcomers could no longer play Sonic 3 Angel Island Revisited, a fan-made mod of the games that is in many ways technically superior to Sega's own remastering efforts. See our video on Simon Tomley's disappointment with Sega to learn more on that. It also meant removing the one place where the original Sonic 3 music, composed by Michael Jackson's team, including Brad Buxer, could be legally purchased direct from Sega. Even in a case where a remastered game is available for legal download, something is lost in the transition to a new version of the title. We call this the Star Wars Special Edition conundrum. Yes, in some ways the remaster is an improvement, but some people are always going to prefer the original, and would rather that the past isn't completely removed from sale. On the other hand, the general experience of playing Sonic 3 is still intact in Sonic Origins, and this version of the game is the one that Sega wants people to buy in the modern era. How much do the changes actually matter? When we got to Ice Cap Zone as a family last week, we lowered the volume on the TV and called up the original music on YouTube on a phone to get the full experience. Our daughter would accept nothing less. All of this leads inexorably to the fundamental question around retro video game piracy. Why is game piracy necessary in the first place? Why do games companies and copyright holders dismiss older games so readily? Why don't companies like Warner Brothers or Nintendo or Sega see the value of these original experiences? And, in turn, why does downloading a Sonic 3 ROM feel fundamentally different to, for example, pirating Sonic Frontiers? A book that was written in 1995 has the same value today as it had then. Why are games any different? Chapter 3. Games as Waste. Internet piracy fundamentally broke the music industry. This much is clear from even a cursory glance at how music sales have changed over the past 3 decades. In the era before the internet, music was a lot more expensive. Even when published in the relatively cheap-to-produce compact disc format, buying a music album meant spending upwards of £20. It was common for consumers to make a home copy of their records. You couldn't play a CD in the car. Imagine having a CD player in your car. Wild! So you would transfer it to cassette tape, which your car could play. As the internet grew in popularity, music fans realised just how easy it was to share these homemade copies on the internet, and, at the time, there was no concrete legal precedent suggesting that this was in any way wrong. Not any precedent that anyone cared about, at least. Why would they care? This technology had never existed before. When the music industry realised just how devastating internet piracy was to their business model, they took 2 major actions. 1, they used legal force to dismantle popular sharing platforms such as Napster. 2, they made music legally available online through legitimate channels. The question was, where to price things? Make songs too expensive, and people would rather simply pirate them. So the price per song settled at around the $1 mark, or 89 pence in the UK. This was felt to be the most money the music industry could get away with charging without discouraging legitimate sales. This shift in pricing meant that album costs dropped dramatically, even for physical media. It also meant that music artists had to rethink their revenue streams. As the songs dropped in price, the prices for gig tickets increased instead. To a certain extent, the songs began to serve as advertising for the real product, which became live performances. Perhaps Valve co-founder Gabe Newell would disagree with the choice of lowering the cost of music. He is famously quoted as having said, "One thing that we have learned is that piracy is not a pricing issue, it's a service issue." The easiest way to stop piracy is not by putting anti-piracy technology to work. It's by giving those people a service that's better than what they're receiving from the pirates. This may be the case for Steam, but the fact remains that pricing is a part of the service that online stores offer, and it also informs potential pirates' impressions of the perceived value of the products they are pirating. Many people who pirate retro games wouldn't dream of pirating modern titles that sell in shops and online for £50 apiece. This is hardly a surprise, given that the games industry has spent the past 40 years insisting over and over that games that are more than a year old are entirely worthless. In retrospect, a focus on fresh, new, innovative technology was always going to end poorly for the games industry. The leap in graphical complexity between the PlayStation 1 and 2, for example, is far more noticeable than the difference between the PlayStation 4 and 5. There are diminished returns on selling a game or console based purely on a relative level of realism. The processing arms race can be traced back to the arcade era, when the difference in power between 2 cabinets could make all the difference. With consumers voting with their pocket change, a game like Space Invaders thrived precisely because it was more visually interesting and technically nuanced than Pong. As this attitude towards graphics and processing power spilled into the home market, those who were marketing games embraced the novelty of highlighting advancements in technology as a primary sales tactic. Why would you buy a 32-bit console when you could get 64 bits instead? As a result of the pace at which games technology has evolved, publishers tend to burn through their titles with relative speed. While a book or a film might enjoy a few years of long-tail sales, games traditionally have a tremendously short shelf life. A game remains full price for a very short time before its value drops, and drops, and drops, as newer, fresher, hotter games take its place on shop shelves. This phenomenon has now, finally, begun to lose some of its steam. Chasing the latest graphics no longer carries quite so much weight amongst consumers. For some older titles, though, the damage is done. In truth, while Nintendo's Virtual Console on the Wii did wonders for making retro games more accessible to newer fans, it did a lot to calcify the perceived cost of older games. NES games are worth half as much as SNES games, which are worth half as much again as Nintendo 64 games, or so Nintendo would have you believe. This pricing was no doubt informed both by the perceived value of retro games during this era, and, as with online music sales, by an awareness that Nintendo was competing with retro piracy as the alternative viable option for many consumers. How much could they charge, yet again, for Super Mario Bros. On the NES before the price felt extortionate? The other side of this is that gamers now have a definitive price point from which to value each illegally downloaded game. And with many older games costing pocket change to download legally, an illegal download doesn't feel like a tremendously heinous crime, especially if you simply weren't going to buy it either way. The public perception of older games is informed, therefore, by their relative market value, or, at least, their relative market value before the recent bubble formed around retro game collecting. Another case where many of you feel that retro piracy is justified is when a game's physical value on the second-hand market far outweighs its perceived actual value. Let's use that familiar staple, Pokémon Red, as an example. At the time of making this video, Pokémon Red can be purchased for $8.99 on the Nintendo 3DS eShop. This, then, is the game's value, right? That's what Nintendo says the game is worth, that's what they want to charge for it. If you're watching this video after the 27th of March 2023 though, hello from the past, we do things differently here. You can't purchase Pokémon Red anymore. Perhaps by the time you're watching this, the game is on Nintendo Switch Online, but presently, Nintendo has not announced plans to make this game available on modern hardware. So, the only legal way to play a game which is apparently worth £9 is to buy it second-hand, where it generally sells for... oh no. So if Nintendo thinks the game is worth £9, but the game can't be bought for less than £30, and if none of that £30 goes to the copyright holders anyway, and even if a game is on Nintendo Switch Online, if it's bundled as part of a subscription service that you were already paying for, it's basically free, right? So what does it matter to Nintendo if you're playing a ROM on your phone rather than playing the same thing on the Switch? This brings us to the question of form factor when pirating. Here, Gabe Newell's quote definitely rings true. Piracy is a service issue. For a game like Final Fantasy VII, there are myriad options available for potential customers. The game can be bought on all modern console platforms, on PC and even on mobile, in its original form. Alternatively, newer versions of the game can be bought for those who want a more modern experience with fancier graphics. Until relatively recently, the game was even available direct from the Square Enix website, on disc, for the original PlayStation. The game is available with plenty of choice for consumers. In contrast, Final Fantasy Tactics Advance is currently only available for purchase on the Wii U eShop, and even then, it's going to disappear fairly soon. Even if or when the game is added to Nintendo Switch Online, what if players want to enjoy the game on other platforms? On Android devices, for example. To a certain extent, players are limited by the service options that publishers provide. If a game is only available on a Nintendo platform, then this is the way it was intended to be played. And certainly, with some games, the hardware has informed the game's design to the point that emulation on any other platform will lack a certain amount of the experience. Take, for example, Boktai or Kirby Tilt and Tumble, games that can be made functional without their cartridge gimmicks, but which ultimately lose their primary gameplay mechanics. At the same time, many players feel that, if they own a game on another platform, if they choose to rip their own ROM and play it on an emulator, there's no harm done. And if they lack the equipment to make their own ROMs, there's nothing inherently wrong with downloading a pirated ROM. After all, they still paid for the game, so why shouldn't they use it as they see fit? The legal implications of ripping a game ROM for personal use will depend both on the country you live in and the era in which you live, as modern copyright law struggles to keep up with the intricacies of the rapidly evolving online world. The reality is that common practices regarding copyright protections don't always line up with the protections and restrictions within copyright law. Conclusion: the slow march of progress. In 1988, the United Kingdom introduced the Copyright Designs and Patents Act. It's a law that now shows its age, not least due to the fact that it has turned generations of British citizens into unwitting criminals. Among its many nuances, the law states that it is illegal to make private copies of digital media, such as CDs, DVDs and video games, for personal use. This is useful for the aforementioned issue with car cassette players, or if you want to put music CDs onto an MP3 player, or backup ROMs. In 1988, this kind of copying wasn't common, but as technology developed, many British people unwittingly broke the law. By 2011, it became clear that the practice of private copying was so commonplace that the law needed an update, and it finally got one in 2014. The official guidance for this issue, still present on the gov.uk website, reads: "Copyright law has been changed to allow you to make personal copies of media, ebooks, digital music or video files, etc. you have bought for private purposes such as format shifting or backup. Before this changed the law, it was not legal to copy music that you bought on a CD onto your MP3 player. The changes, which apply from 1st October, update copyright law to make this legal, as long as you own what you are copying, example a music album, and the copy you make is for your own private use. You are also able to copy a book or film you have bought for one of your devices onto another of your devices without infringing copyright." It took a long time, but the British people now had a legal exemption, enshrined in law, that allowed them to do something they'd been happily doing anyway without realising it was illegal. This legal exemption lasted less than a year. The Musicians' Union, UK Music and the British Academy of Songwriters, Composers and Authors took the UK government to court and successfully had the exemption overturned. The UK music industry's primary reason for doing so was that they would lose out on around £58 million per year from people buying the same music twice. The UK music industry generates around £4 billion annually. Thus, from October 2014 to July 2015, copying media for personal use was legal in Britain. Now, it is yet again against the law. What does this mean in practice? Very little. Most people are unaware of this law and carry on making personal copies without concern. Governments around the world have found it difficult to adapt to the internet era, especially as trends and habits have changed over time. Delving too deeply into these issues would require an entire separate video, so we'll keep things simple for now. Even our original statement that video game piracy is illegal is more complicated and nuanced than it appears at first glance. It doesn't do justice to the debate surrounding times when common practices stand in conflict with the letter of the law. There's no one single blanket stance on retro piracy and morality. Some people feel more justified with some forms of piracy than others, depending on the games in question and the wider context around their availability. As stated, we are not here to give a concrete moral judgment, as the line in the sand will be different for every person. If we are to give a definitive standpoint on anything, it's that modern copyright and intellectual property law is inadequate to cover the nuances and complexities of digital entertainment, especially video games, in an increasingly online world. That's as close as we can get to a moral for this video. Thank you for watching.